Alexander Blackwood's blood turned to ice as the wild horse's hooves crashed down inches from his head, dirt and leaves staining the suit that had intimidated countless boardrooms. The pristine forest he'd come to destroy was about to transform the ruthless millionaire in ways that would leave everyone, especially himself, utterly stunned. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The estate of Alexander Blackwood sprawled across 50 acres of prime countryside, a testament to the power and wealth he had accumulated over the years. Pristine gardens, sculpted by a team of landscapers, surrounded the mansion's marble facade. Inside, crystal chandeliers reflected light across polished marble floors, while priceless art adorned walls that had never known a single fingerprint. This wasn't just a home. It was a monument to success, ambition, and ruthless determination. Alexander himself was the embodiment of calculated precision. At 45, his salt and pepper hair was always perfectly trimmed, his custom Italian suits impeccably tailored to his athletic frame. Every morning followed the same routine: a 5-mile run on his private track, a protein shake prepared by his personal chef, and a series of calls to his financial team before most people had even silenced their alarm clocks. There was a coldness to his eyes that made his employees tremble and his business rivals surrender before negotiations even began. Alexander hadn't become one of the country's most successful real estate developers by being kind or patient. He had clawed his way to the top, and the scratches he left on others during his climb were badges of honor in his mind. The Anderson Forest property, Alexander muttered, reviewing the documents spread across his mahogany desk. His fingers, adorned only with a platinum watch worth more than most people's homes, tapped impatiently on the glossy surface. 2,000 acres of untouched wilderness. Perfect. Marcus, his chief legal advisor, shifted uncomfortably in the leather chair across from him. There are some complications, sir. The environmental impact studies suggest— I don't pay you to tell me about complications, Marcus. Alexander cut him off, his voice quiet but sharp enough to draw blood. I pay you to make them disappear. Marcus nodded, swallowing hard. Of course, sir. But the local community is quite attached to this forest. There's a petition with over 10,000 signatures, and the Wildlife Preservation Society has— Alexander's hand slammed down on the desk, causing the crystal paperweight to jump. 10,000 signatures, he scoffed. I employ 20,000 people across my companies. One word from me, and half those petition signers would be worrying about feeding their families instead of saving squirrels. He stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, overlooking his immaculate gardens. In the distance, he could see the edge of the forest that bordered his property, wild, untamed, and utterly useless in its current state. The Anderson Forest was 5 times that size, and he already had investors lined up for the luxury resort and golf course he planned to build there. Schedule a visit, Alexander said finally, still staring at the tree line. Tomorrow morning, I want to see this precious forest for myself. Yes, sir, Marcus replied, already pulling out his phone to make the arrangements. Will you be taking the helicopter? Alexander turned, a rare smile playing on his lips. No, I think I'll drive myself. The black Range Rover. Sometimes it's good to get your hands dirty. The next morning arrived crisp and clear, with a gentle mist hovering over the landscape. Alexander, dressed in what he considered casual, a tailored charcoal suit without a tie and Italian leather shoes polished to a mirror shine, slid into the driver's seat of his Range Rover. The interior smelled of expensive leather and the subtle notes of his signature cologne. As he drove toward the Anderson Forest, Alexander rehearsed the arguments he would use against the environmental protesters: jobs, economic growth, tax revenue for schools. He had turned forests into fortunes before, and this one would be no different. People always resisted change until they saw the benefits lining their pockets. The narrow road leading to the forest entrance was unpaved, much to Alexander's annoyance. Dust collected on his pristine vehicle and the bumpy surface jostled him uncomfortably. His irritation grew with each passing minute. By the time he reached the small dirt parking area at the forest's edge, his mood had darkened considerably. Stepping out of the car, Alexander straightened his jacket and retrieved his leather briefcase. It contained all the documents he needed: ownership papers for the adjacent land, preliminary development plans, and financial projections that would make any local official's eyes widen with greed. The forest path before him was barely visible, overgrown with vegetation that seemed determined to reclaim any human intrusion. Alexander hesitated, glancing down at his shoes. They weren't made for this kind of terrain. Still, he needed to see enough of this place to speak about it convincingly when the protests inevitably intensified. "Just a quick walk," he muttered to himself, stepping carefully onto the path. The transition from open space to forest was immediate and disorienting. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy in fragmented beams, creating a dappled effect on the forest floor. The sounds of the outside world faded, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves and distant birdsong. Despite himself, Alexander felt a strange sensation in his chest, a loosening as if his body was remembering how to breathe properly for the first time in years. He shook the feeling off and continued walking, his briefcase clutched tightly in one hand, while the other occasionally swatted at insects that dared to approach him. The path twisted deeper into the forest, and Alexander followed it mechanically, his mind already calculating profit margins and construction timelines. 20 minutes into his walk, the path opened into a small clearing bathed in sunlight. Alexander paused, taking in the scene before him. Wildflowers carpeted the ground in bursts of purple, yellow, and white. Butterflies danced between them in a choreographed display that seemed almost deliberately beautiful. "Pretty," he acknowledged coldly, "but beauty doesn't generate revenue." As if in response to his callous remark, a sound broke the forest's tranquility, a heavy rustling followed by what could only be described as a snort. Alexander froze, his senses suddenly alert to potential danger. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by the distinct cracking of branches. From the edge of the clearing, a magnificent chestnut horse emerged. It moved with a wild grace that immediately identified it as untamed. Its coat gleamed copper in the sunlight, muscles rippling beneath as it stepped cautiously into the open space. Alexander stood perfectly still, briefcase clutched to his chest like a shield. He had never been comfortable around animals. They were unpredictable, messy, and impossible to control through intimidation or money. This horse, with its proud bearing and intense gaze, awakened something primal in him, a recognition of something powerful that owed him nothing. The horse noticed him immediately, ears pricking forward in curiosity or alarm. It took another step forward, then stopped, nostrils flaring as it caught his unfamiliar scent. For a moment they simply regarded each other, man and beast, each foreign to the other's world. Alexander's phone rang suddenly, shattering the silence with its shrill electronic tone. The horse reared in surprise, front hooves pawing at the air as it let out a terrified whinny that echoed through the clearing. Time seemed to slow as Alexander watched the massive animal rising before him, silhouetted against the forest backdrop. In that moment, the illusion of control that had defined his existence fell away. Here his wealth meant nothing. His power was meaningless. He was simply a man, fragile and mortal, facing a force of nature that could crush him without malice or mercy. As the horse's hooves descended, Alexander Blackwood, who had never backed down from anything in his life, did the only thing his instincts allowed. He turned and ran. Alexander Blackwood ran blindly through the forest, his perfectly polished shoes slipping on the uneven ground. Branches whipped across his face, tearing at his expensive suit as panic drove him forward. The thunder of hooves behind him sent adrenaline coursing through his veins, his heart hammering against his ribs with such force he thought it might burst. He had never run like this before, not in his carefully controlled life of boardrooms and luxury cars. This was primal, desperate flight. His briefcase, that precious container of contracts and power, was long forgotten, dropped somewhere in the clearing when survival became his only priority. A root caught his foot, sending him sprawling face first onto the forest floor. Alexander rolled instinctively, leaves and dirt clinging to his once immaculate suit. The fall knocked the wind from his lungs, leaving him gasping like a fish out of water. Through blurred vision, he saw the massive chestnut horse approaching, its movements no longer panicked but cautious, almost curious. "Stay back," Alexander gasped, scrambling backward until his spine pressed against the rough bark of an ancient oak. "Get away from me!" The horse snorted, tossing its magnificent head as if offended by his tone. It took another step forward, hooves delicately picking a path through the undergrowth. Alexander pressed himself harder against the tree, as if he could somehow melt into its solid trunk. The animal was close enough now that he could see the muscles twitching beneath its gleaming coat, could feel the warmth of its breath. What happened next would forever remain a blur in Alexander's memory. Whether the horse was spooked by a sudden movement or simply decided to assert its dominance, its front hooves rose again in a display of power that seemed to block out the sun. Alexander raised his arms in a futile attempt to protect himself, a strangled cry escaping his throat. The impact never came. Instead, a sharp whistle cut through the air, causing the horse's ears to prick up. It lowered its hooves to the ground and turned its head toward the sound, momentarily forgetting the terrified man cowering beneath the tree. "Easy there, Ember. Easy, boy." The voice was female, soft but authoritative. From between the trees emerged a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, dressed in worn jeans and a faded flannel shirt. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her movements as she approached the wild horse were slow and deliberate. Alexander watched in disbelief as the woman extended her hand toward the animal that had nearly trampled him seconds before. The horse, Ember, she had called it, snorted again but remained still as she gently touched its neck. "That's it," she murmured, her voice barely audible to Alexander. "No one's going to hurt you." The horse lowered its head, allowing her to stroke its muzzle. The transformation was remarkable, from wild, dangerous beast to docile companion in mere moments. Only when the horse was completely calm did the woman turn her attention to Alexander. Her eyes, Alexander noted with surprise, held no recognition of his status or wealth, only concern tinged with suspicion. "Are you hurt?" she asked plainly. Alexander attempted to regain his composure, straightening his torn jacket as he pushed himself to his feet. "I'm fine," he replied curtly, though his shaking hands betrayed him. "That beast of yours nearly killed me." The woman's expression hardened. "Ember isn't mine. He's wild, and this is his home." She gestured to the forest around them. "You're the visitor here." Alexander bristled at her tone. No one spoke to him like this. Not his employees, not his peers, not even his ex-wife during their bitter divorce. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he demanded. "Someone who doesn't know much about horses, clearly," she replied, unfazed. "Or forests, for that matter. What are you doing out here in a suit and those shoes?" Before Alexander could respond, with the indignation building in his throat, a sharp pain shot through his ankle, the one he had twisted in his fall. He winced, involuntarily shifting his weight to his good leg. The woman noticed immediately. "You are hurt. Let me see." "I said I'm fine," Alexander snapped, taking a step back and immediately regretting it as pain flared again. "I just need to get back to my car." "And which direction would that be?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. Alexander looked around, suddenly aware that in his panic, He had lost all sense of direction. The forest looked the same in every direction: trees, undergrowth, dappled sunlight. There was no sign of the path he had followed, no indication of which way led back to civilization. The realization must have shown on his face, because the woman's expression softened slightly. "I thought as much. I'm Lily, by the way. Lily Carter." Alexander hesitated before responding, unaccustomed to introducing himself. Usually his reputation preceded him. Alexander Blackwood. If his name meant anything to her, she didn't show it. "Well, Mr. Blackwood, you have two options. Try to find your way back with that injured ankle, or let me help you to my cabin. It's not far, and I can take a look at that sprain." "Cabin? You live out here?" Alexander looked at her with newfound curiosity. The woman, Lily, didn't fit his mental image of a forest-dwelling hermit. "Just on the edge of the forest. My grandfather left it to me." She turned to the horse, which had been standing quietly nearby. "Ember will lead the way. He always does." Alexander eyed the horse warily. "That thing tried to kill me." Lily laughed, the sound unexpectedly melodic in the quiet forest. "If Ember wanted to hurt you, we wouldn't be having this conversation. He was just frightened by whatever noise startled him." She paused, studying Alexander's face. "He's a good judge of character, though. Always has been." There was something in her tone that suggested Alexander had been judged and found wanting. The thought irritated him, but his throbbing ankle and growing awareness of his predicament tempered his response. "Fine," he conceded, his voice clipped. "Lead the way." Lily nodded and turned to Ember, whispering something to the horse that Alexander couldn't hear. To his amazement, the animal seemed to understand, turning to walk slowly through the trees. Lily offered her shoulder for support, which Alexander reluctantly accepted after attempting another painful step on his own. As they followed the wild horse deeper into the forest, Alexander became acutely aware of how out of place he was in this environment. His expensive watch, now scratched from his fall, seemed absurdly ostentatious. His torn designer suit, covered in dirt and leaves, was a liability rather than an asset. Even his cologne, which usually conveyed power and sophistication, seemed jarring against the natural scents of the forest. Most disconcerting of all was his complete dependence on this stranger, this woman who lived on the fringes of civilization and communicated with wild horses. Alexander Blackwood, who controlled the fates of thousands with the stroke of a pen, couldn't even find his way back to his own car without help. The irony was not lost on him, and it left a bitter taste in his mouth as he limped alongside Lily, following the very animal that had brought him to this humiliating position. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that perhaps this forest, the one he intended to destroy, was exacting its revenge before he'd even begun. The journey through the forest seemed interminable to Alexander. Each step sent jolts of pain up his leg, and the uneven terrain didn't help matters. The wild horse, Ember, moved ahead of them with surprising gentleness, occasionally stopping to look back as if ensuring they were still following. "Not much farther now," Lily said, adjusting her grip on Alexander's arm to better support his weight. "There's a stream just beyond those trees, and my cabin is on the other side." Alexander merely grunted in response. The pain and humiliation had soured his mood further, and he had no interest in making small talk with this forest woman. Yet despite his determination to remain aloof, he found himself curious about her. Who chooses to live on the edge of civilization? What kind of person forms bonds with wild animals and seems more comfortable with trees than people? As they crossed a small clearing, Alexander noticed something that made him pause. Lily was guiding them along a barely visible path, not man-made, but a natural corridor through the undergrowth. It occurred to him that she wasn't just wandering. She knew this forest intimately, reading it like he read financial reports. "How do you know where you're going?" he asked, finally breaking the silence. "There's no path." Lily smiled, the expression transforming her face. Alexander noticed for the first time that she was actually quite attractive in an earthy, unrefined way, nothing like the polished, sophisticated women who typically orbited his world. "The forest has its own paths if you know how to see them," she replied. "Animals create trails over time, deer, foxes, even Ember. I just follow what's already there." They reached the promised stream, a clear ribbon of water flowing over smooth stones. The sound of it was soothing, almost hypnotic. Ember approached the water's edge and drank deeply, his powerful neck curved in a graceful arc. "We'll rest here for a minute," Lily said, helping Alexander to a fallen log. "You should drink something too. The forest air is deceptively dry." Alexander wanted to refuse on principle, but his parched throat overruled his pride. He watched as Lily knelt by the stream, cupping her hands to bring him water. The gesture was so simple, so unaffected by pretense that it caught him off guard. "Thank you," he said stiffly, accepting the water. It was cold and startlingly sweet, nothing like the filtered, bottled water he was accustomed to. Lily sat beside him, not too close but not notably distant either. She seemed comfortable with silence, another novelty for Alexander, whose world was filled with constant noise, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, people vying for his attention and approval. "So, Alexander Blackwood," she said finally, "what brings a man in a $3,000 suit to wander alone in Anderson Forest?" Alexander's eyebrows rose slightly. "You recognize designer suits but live in a cabin in the woods?" "I wasn't born in the forest," Lily replied with a small smile. "I had another life before this one. But you didn't answer my question." Alexander hesitated, unaccustomed to direct questioning. Most people tiptoed around him, afraid to provoke his legendary temper. "I'm considering acquiring this land for development," he said finally, watching her face for a reaction. To his surprise, Lily didn't look shocked or angry. She merely nodded, as if his answer confirmed a suspicion. "The luxury resort and golf course. I've heard rumors." "Then you know who I am." "I know your reputation," she corrected. "The Blackwood name is hard to miss on half the buildings in the city, but a name and a reputation aren't the same as knowing someone." There was something in her tone, not judgmental exactly, but clear-eyed in a way that made Alexander uncomfortable. Before he could respond, Ember approached, nudging Lily's shoulder gently with his muzzle. "Time to go," she said, rising from the log. "Ember gets impatient when he's leading us home." They continued their journey, crossing the stream at a shallow point. Alexander noticed that Lily didn't hesitate to step into the water, her worn boots apparently unconcerned with getting wet. He, on the other hand, teetered precariously on stepping stones, desperate to keep his Italian leather shoes from further damage. Beyond the stream, the forest began to thin, and soon Alexander could see a small clearing ahead. In it stood a cabin that defied his expectations. He had imagined something rustic and primitive, a shack with peeling paint and a sagging roof. Instead, the structure before him was modest but well-maintained, with a covered porch that wrapped around two sides and large windows that would capture the sunlight at different times of day. A small garden flourished beside the cabin, vegetables and herbs growing in neat rows. Solar panels gleamed on the south-facing portion of the roof, and a stack of firewood was neatly arranged against one wall. "This is not what I expected," Alexander admitted as they approached. "Most things in the forest aren't what people expect," Lily replied. "That's the problem with expectations. They often blind us to what's actually there." Inside, the cabin was simple but surprisingly comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a small kitchen area opposite. Bookshelves overflowed with well-worn volumes, and a desk beneath one window held a laptop and what looked like scientific equipment. Specimen jars, a microscope, notebooks filled with handwritten notes. "You're a scientist?" Alexander asked, surprised. "Botanist," Lily confirmed, helping him to a comfortable-looking armchair. "I study the medicinal properties of native plants. That's partly why I live out here. My research subjects are all around me." She knelt before him, carefully removing his shoe to examine his ankle. Her touch was clinical but gentle as she assessed the damage. "Not broken, but a nasty sprain. You're lucky." Alexander snorted. "Lucky isn't the word I'd choose for today's events." "No?" Lily raised an eyebrow. "You wandered alone into an unfamiliar forest, encountered a wild horse, fell and injured yourself, and then happened to cross paths with perhaps the only person within miles who could help you. I'd call that lucky." When she put it that way, Alexander found it hard to argue. He watched as she moved efficiently around the cabin, gathering supplies, a bandage, some kind of salve that smelled of herbs, an ice pack that she retrieved from a surprisingly modern refrigerator. "Most people think I'm primitive because I live out here," Lily said, noticing his expression as she returned with the ice pack. "But I'm not against technology. I just use it differently. Solar power, satellite internet for my research, a rainwater collection system." As she wrapped his ankle with practiced hands, Alexander found himself revising his initial assessment of Lily Carter. She wasn't some forest-dwelling hermit or anti-civilization radical. She was educated, articulate, and had clearly made a deliberate choice to live as she did, not out of ignorance or inability to succeed in the real world, but out of preference. "Why here?" he asked suddenly. "With your education, you could work anywhere. Research labs, universities, pharmaceutical companies." Lily finished securing the bandage before answering. She sat back on her heels, her expression thoughtful. "Because here, I'm not just studying nature from a distance. I'm part of it. The forest teaches me things no laboratory ever could." She gestured to the window, where Ember could be seen grazing peacefully in the clearing. "And I have colleagues like him to remind me what really matters." For the first time since entering the forest, Alexander Blackwood felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, not quite understanding, but perhaps the beginning of curiosity about a way of life so utterly different from his own. Night fell quickly in the forest, darkness seeping through the trees like spilled ink. Alexander sat by the window of Lily's cabin, watching as the last traces of daylight faded from the sky. His ankle, now properly bandaged and elevated, throbbed dully, a constant reminder of his vulnerability in this unfamiliar world. "Your phone won't work out here," Lily said, noticing him checking his device for the dozenth time. "No cell service. I have a satellite phone for emergencies, but it's getting late to arrange a pickup for you tonight." Alexander glared at the useless rectangle of technology in his hand. No service meant no calls to his assistant, no emails to his legal team, no way to check if Marcus had managed to handle the day's crises in his absence. It was like being cut off from his own body. "You mean I'm stuck here?" The thought of spending the night in this rustic cabin, however neat and functional it might be, filled Alexander with a strange mix of dread and disorientation. Lily shrugged, stoking the small fire she'd built in the fireplace. "Just until morning. I can take you back to your car first thing, or call someone to come get you if your ankle's too painful for walking." Alexander watched her movements as she prepared a simple meal, some kind of vegetable stew that filled the cabin with rich, earthy aromas. Despite himself, his stomach growled appreciatively. "I don't suppose you have a restaurant menu I could look at," he said, his attempt at humor falling flat even to his own ears. "The kitchen serves whatever the forest provides," Lily replied without looking up from her cooking. "Tonight that's wild mushroom and herb stew with bread I baked yesterday. If that doesn't meet your standards, you're welcome to fast until morning." There was no malice in her voice, just a matter-of-factness that Alexander found both refreshing and irritating. Everyone in his life catered to his preferences, anticipated his needs, jumped to accommodate his whims. Lily treated him like anyone else. The novelty was almost as disorienting as being lost in the forest had been. When she placed a steaming bowl before him, Alexander hesitated only briefly before taking a spoonful. The flavors that burst on his tongue were complex and vibrant, nothing like the sophisticated but often sterile cuisine of the high-end restaurants he frequented. "This is quite good," he admitted, surprised by his own reaction. Lily smiled, settling into a chair across from him with her own bowl. "Food tastes better when you know where it comes from. The mushrooms grow near the stream we crossed. The herbs are from my garden. Even the salt is harvested from a mineral deposit deeper in the forest." They ate in silence for a while, the crackling fire and distant hooting of an owl providing a soundtrack utterly foreign to Alexander's urban existence. He found himself noticing details he would normally overlook, the way firelight danced across Lily's face, highlighting cheekbones that could belong on a magazine cover, if not for the stubborn smudge of dirt she'd missed when washing up. The pleasant weight of the handcrafted ceramic bowl in his hands, the complex symphony of forest sounds outside the window. "So," Lily said finally, breaking the silence, "tell me about this development you're planning." Alexander tensed, expecting the confrontation he'd been bracing for since revealing his intentions. But Lily's expression remained neutral, curious rather than accusatory. "It's a comprehensive luxury resort," he said carefully. "Hotel, spa, golf course, high-end residential units. The kind of place where people can disconnect from their everyday stress and reconnect with nature." Lily's eyebrow rose slightly at his last words. "Reconnect with nature? By paving over it and adding a golf course?" "We're bringing nature to people in a way they can appreciate," Alexander countered, slipping easily into his practiced pitch. "Most people don't want to forage for mushrooms or live without cell service. They want comfort while they enjoy scenic views. And what about the people who already appreciate this forest as it is? The hikers, the bird watchers, the families who've been coming here for generations?" "Progress always has costs," Alexander said dismissively. "The development will create jobs, increase property values in the region, generate tax revenue." "I'm familiar with the economic arguments," Lily interrupted, her voice still calm but with a new edge to it. "What I'm asking is whether you've considered the non-economic values of this place." Alexander's brow furrowed. "Non-economic values?" "The worth that can't be calculated in dollars. Biodiversity, ecosystem services, cultural and spiritual significance." Lily set her empty bowl aside. "Did you know this forest contains plant species found nowhere else in the region, or that it's a critical stopover point for 3 endangered migratory bird species?" Alexander shifted uncomfortably. These were precisely the kinds of complications he paid people like Marcus to handle, or more accurately, to make disappear with the right permits, variances, and occasionally strategic donations to the right political campaigns. "Environmental impact studies can be conducted," he said stiffly. "Appropriate mitigations can be implemented." Lily laughed, though the sound held little humor. "You can't mitigate the loss of an ecosystem, Alexander. Nature doesn't work that way. Everything here is connected: the soil, the plants, the animals, the water. Change one element and you affect everything else." She rose from her chair and crossed to one of the many bookshelves, returning with a thick binder. Opening it on the table between them, she revealed page after page of detailed notes, photographs, and pressed plant specimens. "I've been documenting this forest's biodiversity for 5 years," she explained, turning pages with obvious care. "These aren't just pretty flowers or interesting mushrooms. Their potential medicines, foods, natural compounds with properties we're only beginning to understand. Alexander glanced at the pages with reluctant interest. He'd never given much thought to what actually lived in the forest he developed. Trees were trees, some more visually appealing than others, but ultimately interchangeable elements in a landscape design. "This one," Lily said, pointing to a photograph of a modest white flower, "contains a compound that preliminary studies suggest could help treat certain types of leukemia. And this fungus," she turned to another page, "produces antibiotics effective against bacteria that have developed resistance to our standard medications." Despite himself, Alexander found his attention caught by the precision of her documentation, the careful methodology evident in her notes. This wasn't the work of some tree-hugging idealist, but of a serious scientist. The realization was uncomfortable. It was easier to dismiss opposition when it came from emotional environmentalists rather than researchers with data. "The world needs both preservation and progress," he said finally, falling back on one of his standard responses to environmental concerns. "There's room for both." "Is there?" Lily closed the binder gently. "When progress means destroying something irreplaceable, is that really moving forward at all?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswered as the fire crackled and night deepened around the small cabin. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Alexander Blackwood found himself without a ready response, without a clear path to getting what he wanted. The sensation was as unfamiliar as the forest itself, and just as disquieting. Alexander awoke to unfamiliar sounds, birdsong instead of traffic, wind rustling through leaves rather than the climate-controlled hum of his penthouse. For a disorienting moment, he couldn't remember where he was. The bed beneath him was firm but comfortable, nothing like his custom mattress that had cost more than some people's monthly salary. Sunlight streamed through simple curtains, casting patterns on the wooden floor that somehow seemed more genuine than the carefully designed lighting schemes of his various homes. Reality crashed back as he shifted and pain shot through his ankle. The forest, the horse, Lily. He sat up, grimacing. The small guest room was Spartan but clean. A bed, a chair, a small dresser. His ruined suit jacket hung over the back of the chair, a sad reminder of yesterday's humiliations. He was still wearing his dress shirt and pants, having refused Lily's offer of borrowed clothes the night before. A soft knock at the door preceded Lily's voice. "Breakfast is ready when you are. There's a walking stick by the door if you want to try moving around." Alexander grunted acknowledgement, then realized she probably couldn't hear him. "I'll be out shortly," he called, the formal words sounding strangely stiff in this rustic setting. Using the promised walking stick, a smooth piece of wood that looked hand-carved, Alexander made his way painfully to the small bathroom attached to the guest room. The mirror revealed a stranger, Alexander Blackwood, with rumpled hair, a day's stubble shadowing his jaw, and smudges of dirt still visible on his face despite his attempts to clean up the night before. He looked ordinary, vulnerable, human. The thought was so disturbing that he turned away from his reflection. When he emerged into the main room of the cabin, he found Lily setting a simple breakfast on the table: eggs, some kind of grain porridge, berries, and steaming coffee. Through the window, he could see Ember grazing peacefully in the morning light. "Your horse seems to have made himself at home," Alexander commented, lowering himself carefully into a chair. "He's not my horse," Lily corrected, pouring coffee into a hand-thrown mug. "Ember comes and goes as he pleases. We have an understanding, that's all." "An understanding? With a wild animal?" Alexander couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. Lily smiled, unperturbed. "Isn't that what all relationships are, ultimately? Understanding and respecting another living being's nature?" She placed the mug before him. "How's the ankle this morning?" "Painful," Alexander admitted. "But I can walk after a fashion. I need to get back to my car and back to the city. I have meetings, Deadlines. The forest doesn't care about your deadlines, Alexander. Lily interrupted, her tone matter-of-fact rather than unkind. But yes, I'll help you back to your car after breakfast. The satellite phone is charging. We can call ahead to have someone meet you there if you'd like. Alexander took a sip of the coffee, surprised by its rich, complex flavor. You grow this too? He asked, momentarily distracted from thoughts of escape. Trade with a small-scale farmer in Colombia, Lily replied, sitting across from him. I send medicinal plant compounds, they send coffee. No middlemen, no corporations, just fair exchange. Sounds inefficient. Depends on how you measure efficiency. If it's just about speed and volume, sure. But if you consider ethics, sustainability, and quality, she shrugged. Different metrics lead to different conclusions. Alexander found himself studying her face as she spoke. The animation in her eyes, the small lines that suggested she smiled often, the complete absence of artifice that characterized every woman in his social circle. Lily Carter was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve, and Alexander Blackwood had built his fortune by solving puzzles others couldn't. What brought you here? He asked suddenly. You mentioned another life before this one. Lily's expression shifted subtly, becoming more guarded. I was on a conventional path once. PhD in botanical sciences from Cornell, research position at a major pharmaceutical company, on track for a director role by 40. What happened? She looked out the window where Ember had raised his head as if listening to their conversation. I discovered that the company I worked for was suppressing research on plant-based compounds that couldn't be patented profitably. Medicines that could help people, affordable, accessible medicines, buried because they wouldn't generate billions in revenue. Alexander shifted uncomfortably. The pharmaceutical company she was describing sounded remarkably like several that occupied prime space in his investment portfolio. I protested internally at first, then more publicly. Lily's voice remained even, but Alexander sensed the story wasn't a happy one. Long story short, I was discredited, pushed out, and blacklisted. My grandfather left me this cabin around the same time. It seemed like, I don't know, synchronicity maybe. A door closing and another opening. So you just gave up? Alexander couldn't keep the judgment from his voice. In his world, setbacks were merely obstacles to overcome, not reasons to retreat. Lily's gaze snapped back to him, suddenly fierce. Is that what you think this is? Giving up? She gestured to the cabin around them, to the forest beyond the windows. I've published more independent research in the last 5 years than I did in my entire corporate career. I've discovered compounds that could revolutionize treatments for diseases that pharmaceutical companies won't touch because the patient populations are too small to be profitable. Alexander found himself chastened by her intensity. I didn't mean... You did, Lily cut him off. You measure success the only way you know how, in dollars, in power, in conquests. This forest, my work, my life, they don't register as valuable because they don't fit your metrics. The accusation stung, partly because Alexander recognized its truth. And what about you? He countered. You judge my world just as harshly. Lily was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. We're both viewing each other through our own lenses. The admission surprised him. Most people he argued with either capitulated entirely or dug in deeper. This willingness to acknowledge her own bias was refreshing. Finish your breakfast, Lily said, her tone softening. We should head out while the day is still cool. They ate in companionable silence, the tension between them not gone but somehow transformed into something less adversarial. When they'd finished, Lily collected a few items in a small backpack, water, a first aid kit, the satellite phone, and they stepped outside into the morning air. Ember approached immediately, nudging Lily's shoulder in what seemed like greeting. To Alexander's surprise, the horse then turned to him. dark eyes regarding him with what felt unsettlingly like intelligence. "He remembers you," Lily said, amusement coloring her voice. "Wonderful," Alexander muttered, keeping a cautious distance. "He won't hurt you," Lily assured him. "I think he was just as startled as you were yesterday. Weren't you, Ember?" she added, stroking the horse's neck. Alexander wasn't convinced, but he noticed the animal's demeanor was indeed different today, curious rather than threatening. Still, he kept his good leg positioned to retreat quickly if necessary. As they began their journey back through the forest, Alexander leaning heavily on the walking stick, he found his gaze drawn upward to the canopy of leaves overhead. Dappled sunlight filtered through, creating a cathedral-like effect that was, he searched for the word, beautiful. When was the last time he had noticed beauty that wasn't manufactured or purchased? He couldn't remember. The forest felt different this morning. Yesterday, Alexander had seen only obstacles, branches to dodge, roots to avoid, undergrowth that snagged at his clothing. Today, with Lily guiding him along the natural pathways she knew so well, he found himself noticing details he'd overlooked before. The intricate patterns of lichen on tree bark, the delicate architecture of spiderwebs glistening with dew, the complex layers of life from forest floor to canopy. "That fallen log there," Lily said, pointing to what Alexander would have dismissed as mere debris, "hosts over 30 species of fungi, insects, and microorganisms. It's a small ecosystem unto itself." Alexander glanced at the decaying wood without comment, but he found himself looking more closely at the next fallen tree they passed. True to Lily's word, it teemed with life. Tiny mushrooms sprouting from crevices, iridescent beetles moving purposefully across the surface, moss creating a velvet carpet along one side. They moved slowly due to his injured ankle, which gave Lily ample opportunity to point out the forest's hidden wonders. She showed him plants with medicinal properties, explained how certain trees communicated through underground fungal networks, identified bird songs that Alexander had never consciously registered before. "You really love this place," he observed as they paused for him to rest his throbbing ankle. Lily looked around, her expression soft with affection. Love is exactly the right word, not in a sentimental greeting card way, in the deep, knowing way you might love another person, seeing both beauty and flaws, understanding complexities, feeling connected on a fundamental level. Alexander couldn't remember the last time he'd felt that kind of love for anything or anyone. His relationships, romantic, familial, professional, were transactional at their core. He respected competence, rewarded loyalty, enjoyed beauty and intelligence. But love, the kind Lily described, that had no place in the world he'd built for himself. Ember had been walking slightly ahead of them, occasionally stopping to graze or drink from small streams they passed. Now the horse circled back, approaching Alexander with what almost seemed like concern. "He's checking on you," Lily said, watching the interaction with evident amusement. "I don't need a horse's sympathy," Alexander replied stiffly, though he found himself less afraid of the animal than he had been. Up close, Ember's eyes held a depth and awareness that was disconcerting, as if the horse was evaluating him, measuring his character in some inscrutable equine way. "Horses are excellent judges of character," Lily commented as if reading his thoughts. "They don't care about your bank account or your social status. They respond to honesty, consistency, and respect." "Are you suggesting I lack those qualities?" Alexander asked, bristling slightly. Lily shrugged. "I'm suggesting that what works in boardrooms and luxury penthouses might not work here. Different worlds, different currencies." Before Alexander could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the forest, a sound so out of place that both humans froze instinctively. Ember's head shot up, ears pricked forward in alarm. "What was that?" Alexander whispered, his heartbeat accelerating. Lily's expression had hardened, all the gentle amusement vanished from her face. Gunshot. Hunting isn't allowed in this part of the forest. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Ember snorted nervously, shifting his weight from hoof to hoof. Poachers, Lily said, her voice tight with anger. They come after the larger deer, sometimes black bears. She reached into her backpack and pulled out the satellite phone, quickly dialing a number. Forest Service. This is Lily Carter. I'm reporting illegal hunting activity in the eastern section of Anderson Forest, about 2 miles from Clearwater Stream. She paused, listening. Yes, I can stay in the area, but at a safe distance. I have a guest with an injured ankle. Another pause. Understood. We'll wait for your call. She ended the call and turned to Alexander. They're sending rangers, but it will take at least 30 minutes for them to reach this area. So we wait? Alexander asked, not entirely comfortable with the idea of remaining near armed poachers. We observe from a safe distance, Lily corrected. If we can identify the poachers or their vehicles, it helps build a case against them. Alexander stared at her incredulously. You're planning to spy on armed criminals? Is this forest worth risking your life for? Yes, Lily replied simply without a moment's hesitation. Wouldn't you risk something to protect what you love? The question caught Alexander off guard. Would he? He'd spent his life accumulating wealth and power. But what would he genuinely risk himself for? Not his possessions. They were replaceable. Not his company. It was insured, diversified, protected by layers of legal safeguards. Perhaps nothing at all, he realized with a strange hollowness in his chest. You don't have to come with me, Lily added, mistaking his silence for reluctance. You can wait here. I'll come back for you after the rangers arrive. Something in her tone, not condescension, not challenge, just a straightforward acknowledgement of his choice, sparked an unexpected response in Alexander. I'm coming with you, he said firmly. I'll slow you down with this ankle, but I'm not hiding while you confront armed men. Surprise and something like respect flashed in Lily's eyes. All right then, stay close and move as quietly as you can. They made their way carefully through the forest, Lily leading them on a circuitous route that kept them concealed by undergrowth. Ember had disappeared, whether from fear of the gunshots or some equine instinct for self-preservation, Alexander couldn't tell. As they drew closer to where the shots had originated, Lily slowed their pace, gesturing for absolute silence. Through a screen of ferns, Alexander could make out a small clearing where 2 men in camouflage clothing were loading something into the back of a mud-splattered pickup truck. They've killed a deer, Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. Out of season and in a protected area. Alexander watched as the men worked quickly, efficiently, their movements suggesting this wasn't their first such operation. One of them, tall, with a scraggly beard and a cigarette dangling from his lips, kept looking around nervously. The other, shorter, stockier, with a red cap pulled low over his eyes, seemed more focused on the task at hand. We need to get closer, Lily murmured. I need to see their license plate. Too dangerous, Alexander replied, keeping his voice equally low. They're armed and clearly experienced at this. Let the rangers handle it. By the time the rangers arrive, they'll be gone, Lily countered. Without identification, there's nothing to pursue. Before Alexander could argue further, the man in the red cap suddenly stiffened, turning in their direction. He raised his hand, silencing his companion, who immediately reached for the rifle propped against the truck. We've been spotted, Alexander hissed, instinctively grabbing Lily's arm to pull her back into the deeper cover of the forest. But instead of retreating, Lily held her ground, reaching slowly into her pocket. Alexander watched in disbelief as she extracted what appeared to be a small camera and raised it to her eye. The click of the shutter seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. Run, Lily said calmly, tucking the camera away. Now, the poacher with the rifle swung it in their direction, shouting something Alexander couldn't make out through the sudden rush of blood in his ears. He turned to flee, forgetting his injured ankle in the surge of adrenaline, and immediately collapsed as pain shot up his leg. The last thing he saw before the forest floor rushed up to meet him was Lily standing protectively over him, facing armed men with nothing but her courage and conviction. Alexander came to with the taste of dirt in his mouth and the sound of angry voices. His vision swam into focus. He was still on the forest floor, pain radiating from his ankle in nauseating waves. Lily stood between him and the approaching poachers, her posture upright and defiant despite the rifle now aimed squarely at her chest. "This is protected land," she was saying, her voice remarkably steady. "The Forest Service has been notified and rangers are on their way. I suggest you leave immediately." The man with the scraggly beard laughed, an ugly sound that echoed through the trees. "By the time rangers get here, we'll be long gone. And so will you two, one way or another." His companion, the stockier man in the red cap, stepped forward. "Just give us the camera, lady, and maybe we don't have to make this messy." "The photos have already been transmitted," Lily lied smoothly. "Satellite uplink. The rangers have your faces and your license plate number." Alexander watched in disbelief as Lily bluffed the armed men. Was she insane, or just so committed to this forest that she would risk her life to protect it? Either way, he realized with startling clarity that he couldn't let her face this danger alone, not when it was his clumsiness that had revealed their position. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Alexander pushed himself up to a sitting position. "She's telling the truth," he called out, drawing the poacher's attention. "I'm Alexander Blackwood. Perhaps you recognize the name?" He saw the flicker of recognition in the bearded man's eyes. Good. His reputation had its uses after all. "I own significant interests in multiple media outlets," Alexander continued, his businessman's voice returning, authoritative, slightly condescending. "If anything happens to either of us, your faces will be on every news channel from here to the East Coast by nightfall." The poachers exchanged uncertain glances. The man in the red cap lowered his rifle slightly, but his companion seemed less convinced. "You expect us to believe some rich guy is out here in the mud with tree huggers?" Scraggly Beard sneered, though Alexander could detect the first hint of doubt in his tone. "Check my wallet," Alexander replied coldly. "In my back pocket. My driver's license, my Blackwood Industries ID, several credit cards that would make your annual salary look like pocket change." It was a gamble. If they took his wallet, they might just decide to eliminate witnesses anyway. But Alexander was counting on the fact that most criminals preferred easy targets. 2 missing hikers might not raise immediate alarms, but a missing corporate executive would trigger searches, investigations, media attention. The gamble seemed to be paying off. The man in the red cap was definitely having second thoughts, shifting his weight nervously and casting glances back at their truck. "Come on, Rick," he muttered to his companion. "It's not worth it. Let's just go." "Shut up, Dale," Scraggly Beard, Rick, snapped. But he too was looking less certain. The rifle in his hands no longer pointed directly at Lily. It was at this precise moment that fate, or perhaps something more deliberate, intervened. A thunderous sound broke through the tense standoff, the unmistakable drumming of hooves on hard earth. All heads turned as Ember burst through the undergrowth, magnificent and terrible in his wild power. The chestnut horse reared up, forelegs pawing the air, his whinny a piercing challenge that seemed to shake the very trees. The poacher's reaction was instantaneous. Red Cap, Dale, stumbled backward with a strangled cry of alarm. Rick raised his rifle instinctively, but Ember was already charging, a force of nature bearing down on them with primal fury. Alexander watched in awe as the men scrambled for their truck, all thoughts of confrontation forgotten in the face of half a ton of muscled horse bearing down on them. The rifle discharged once, the shot going wild as Rick tripped over his own feet in his haste to escape. Seconds later, the truck's engine roared to life, tires spinning in the soft earth before finding purchase. The vehicle fishtailed away, branches snapping under its wheels as it crashed through the undergrowth. Ember pulled up short where the men had been standing, snorting and tossing his head as if in satisfaction at their retreat. Then, with a grace that belied his size, the horse turned and approached Lily and Alexander. "You magnificent creature," Lily breathed, reaching out to stroke Ember's neck. "How did you know?" Alexander stared at the horse, then at Lily. "You're telling me that was a coincidence? He just happened to charge in at the perfect moment?" Lily smiled, a mysterious expression that made her look suddenly ageless, connected to something ancient and knowing. "I told you, Ember and I have an understanding." Before Alexander could question her further, the satellite phone in Lily's pocket rang. She answered it quickly, confirming that yes, the poachers had been there but had fled, and yes, she had photographic evidence of their faces and vehicle. "The Rangers will set up roadblocks," she explained after ending the call. "There are only a few ways out of this area by vehicle. They'll likely catch them." Alexander nodded, still processing what had just occurred. His ankle throbbed mercilessly, but the pain seemed secondary to the realization that had struck him as he faced the poachers. He had been willing to risk himself for this forest, or more accurately, for Lily and what she represented. When was the last time he had put himself in harm's way for something that wasn't about profit or power? "We need to get you back to your car," Lily said, crouching beside him to examine his ankle. "You've aggravated the sprain. Can you stand?" With Lily's support, Alexander managed to get to his feet, wincing as he tested his weight on the injured ankle. "I don't think I can walk all the way back," he admitted reluctantly. Lily looked thoughtful for a moment, then turned to Ember, who had remained nearby, watching them with those intelligent eyes. "I have an idea," she said, "but you're not going to like it." 20 minutes later, Alexander Blackwood, real estate magnate, corporate titan, master of boardrooms and penthouse suites, found himself on the back of a wild horse, clinging to its mane as it walked carefully through the forest. Lily walked alongside, one hand resting lightly on Ember's neck, guiding him along invisible paths only she could see. "I can't believe I'm doing this," Alexander muttered, feeling simultaneously ridiculous and strangely exhilarated. The motion of the horse beneath him was nothing like the mechanical precision of cars or private jets. It was alive, organic, a partnership rather than mere transportation. "You're doing well," Lily encouraged him. "Ember's being exceptionally gentle with you." Alexander looked down at the massive animal carrying him. From this perspective, he could see the powerful muscles moving beneath the gleaming coat, feel the rhythmic breathing, sense the intelligence guiding each careful step. There was something humbling about being carried by a creature that could throw him off in an instant if it chose to. "Why is he helping us?" Alexander asked. "Yesterday he nearly trampled me, and today he's my personal taxi service." Lily laughed, the sound brightening the forest around them. "Ember makes his own judgments about people. Yesterday you were an intruder, today you're—" She paused, considering, perhaps not a friend yet, but no longer an enemy. "And what about you?" Alexander found himself asking. "What am I to you now?" The question seemed to surprise her. She walked in silence for a few steps before answering. "I'm still deciding. Yesterday I thought you were just another developer seeing the forest as nothing but dollar signs. Today—" She glanced up at him, her expression thoughtful. "Today I saw you stand up to armed men when you could have stayed silent. That suggests there might be more to Alexander Blackwood than his reputation indicates." Something about her assessment warmed him in a way that praise for his business acumen or admiration of his wealth never had. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Alexander felt seen, not for what he owned or controlled, but for who he might actually be beneath the carefully constructed persona of success. They emerged from the dense forest into the small clearing where Alexander had parked his Range Rover the previous day. The sleek black vehicle looked strangely out of place now, its polished surfaces and aggressive lines a jarring contrast to the organic shapes and muted colors of the forest. Alexander found himself seeing it through new eyes, as an intrusion rather than a status symbol. Ember stopped at the edge of the clearing, refusing to approach the vehicle. Alexander slid awkwardly from the horse's back, Lily steadying him as his feet touched the ground. The sudden shift from being carried to supporting his own weight sent fresh pain shooting through his ankle. "Easy," Lily murmured, helping him limp toward the car. "You've had quite an adventure for someone who came here just to scout development land." Alexander fumbled in his pocket for his keys, then realized with a sinking feeling that they were probably in his briefcase, the one he'd dropped in the forest during his first encounter with Ember. "My briefcase," he said, turning to Lily. "It has my keys, my phone charger, important documents." "I know where it is," Lily assured him. "I saw it yesterday when I found you. We can get it before you leave." Alexander leaned against the car, relieved but also strangely reluctant to end this unexpected detour from his carefully planned life. "I should thank you," he said formally, "for the help with my ankle, for the shelter last night, and especially for standing between me and those poachers." Lily shrugged, but her eyes held his with an intensity that made him uncomfortable in an entirely new way. "You stood up for yourself too. That was brave, considering your condition." Self-preservation, Alexander dismissed, uncomfortable with praise for anything other than business success. Basic negotiation tactics: find leverage and apply pressure. "Is that how you see everything? As a negotiation?" The question was gentle but probing, and Alexander found himself considering it more seriously than he might have a day ago. "It's how the world works," he said finally, but the words lacked his usual conviction. "Is it?" Lily glanced back at Ember, who was contentedly grazing at the edge of the clearing. "Ember doesn't negotiate, the forest doesn't bargain, they simply are, existing according to principles much older than quarterly reports and profit margins." Alexander shifted his weight, wincing at the pain in his ankle but also at the unexpected accuracy of her assessment. "You make it sound so simple." "Not simple," Lily corrected. "Just true. There are different kinds of truth, Alexander. The kind created by humans, markets, money, power, and the kind that exists whether we acknowledge it or not, like gravity or photosynthesis or the interconnectedness of living systems." Alexander found himself without a ready response, a rare occurrence for a man accustomed to dominating every conversation. He looked past Lily to the forest beyond, seeing now what he had missed on his arrival: the complex layers of life, the silent communication between species, the delicate balance that his development would irrevocably disrupt. "Wait here," Lily said, breaking into his thoughts. "I'll get your briefcase." As she turned to leave, Alexander impulsively reached out to catch her wrist. "Let me come with you." Lily raised an eyebrow. "With your ankle? It's at least a 15-minute walk." "I can manage," he insisted, though he wasn't entirely sure why it mattered so much. "Ember can help again." She studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right." The return journey through the forest was quiet, each of them lost in thought as Ember carried Alexander carefully along the barely visible path. Alexander found himself noticing even more details now: the way sunlight created shifting patterns on the forest floor, the complex symphony of birdsong overhead, the rich earthy scent that seemed to cleanse his lungs of the city's pollution. When they reached the clearing where he'd first encountered Ember, Alexander spotted his briefcase lying half-hidden beneath a fern. The expensive leather was scuffed and dirty, papers spilling from its partially opened clasp. 24 hours ago, the sight would have irritated him. Now it seemed almost amusing, a symbol of how quickly his carefully ordered world had been upended. Lily retrieved the briefcase, handing it up to him as he sat astride Ember. Alexander opened it, relieved to find his car keys and phone still inside. The development plans, however, were damp and mud-stained, the pristine renderings of luxury cabins and manicured golf courses now blurred and smudged. "Your grand vision seems to have suffered some environmental feedback," Lily commented, noting his expression as he surveyed the damaged documents. Alexander closed the briefcase without responding. The plans suddenly seemed less impressive than they had in his office. Artificial impositions on a landscape that was perfect in its wild state. As they made their way back to the car, Alexander found himself thinking about the conversation with Lily the previous night, about her documentation of the forest's biodiversity, about the poachers who saw the land only as a source of illegal profit. Different people, different values, different ways of relating to the same piece of earth. What if there was another option? He said suddenly, breaking the contemplative silence. Lily looked up at him. Another option? For the forest. Not development as I planned it, not complete preservation either. Something in between. She slowed her pace, clearly intrigued. What are you thinking? Alexander wasn't entirely sure himself. The idea was forming as he spoke, a solution emerging from the collision of his old values with the new perspective this forest adventure had forced upon him. A research center, he said, the concept crystallizing. State-of-the-art facilities for studying the medicinal plants you've documented. Sustainable architecture that works with the forest instead of replacing it. Limited accommodations for scientists, students, maybe some carefully managed ecotourism. Lily's expression was cautiously hopeful. And the rest of the forest? Protected, permanently, with a substantial endowment to ensure it stays that way. The words surprised Alexander even as he spoke them, yet they felt right in a way his original plans never had. That's not what I expected from Alexander Blackwood, Lily said carefully, as if afraid to trust this sudden conversion. Alexander laughed, a genuine sound that startled a nearby bird into flight. It's not what I expected either, but I'm beginning to think that expectations can be limiting. They had reached the clearing again. Alexander's Range Rover waited, a portal back to his other life of skyscrapers and stock options. Yet he found himself reluctant to leave this forest that had humbled him, challenged him, and possibly changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Lily helped him down from Ember's back one last time. Their hands lingered together longer than necessary, neither quite ready to break the connection that had formed so unexpectedly. You know, Alexander said, looking into her eyes with newfound clarity, my company has a charitable foundation. It's mostly for tax purposes, I'll admit, but it has considerable resources. Resources that could support independent research like yours. Are you offering me funding, Mr. Blackwood? Lily asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I'm offering a partnership, he corrected. Your knowledge and passion, my resources and influence. Together, we might create something more valuable than either of us could alone. Ember approached, nudging Alexander's shoulder gently with his muzzle. The gesture felt like approval, as if the wild horse was adding his endorsement to this unexpected proposal. 3 days later, Alexander sat in his corner office 52 floors above the city streets, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows that once represented the pinnacle of his success. The metropolitan skyline stretched before him, a testament to human ambition rendered in glass, steel, and concrete. He had always found it inspiring, this evidence of mankind's ability to impose order on chaos, to transform natural landscapes into profitable ventures. Now he found himself searching for patches of green among the gray. "Sir?" His assistant, Caroline, stood in the doorway, her expression betraying the concern she'd been too professional to voice since his return. "The executive team is assembled in the conference room. They're waiting for your presentation on the Anderson Forest project." Alexander nodded, gathering the new plans he'd worked on through 2 sleepless nights after returning from the forest. His ankle, properly treated by his private physician, was healing well. The scratches on his face had faded. Outwardly, he appeared to be the same Alexander Blackwood who had left for a routine site visit less than a week ago. Inwardly, he barely recognized himself. "Sir," Caroline added hesitantly, "Mr. Marcus asked me to remind you about the investors who are specifically interested in the luxury resort concept. They've committed significant capital based on the original prospectus." "Thank you, Caroline," Alexander replied, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. The walk to the conference room felt longer than usual. Each step took him closer to a confrontation, not just with his executive team, but with the values and priorities that had defined his career. He passed walls adorned with architectural renderings of his most profitable developments, golf communities built on former wetlands, luxury high-rises where working-class neighborhoods once stood, resort complexes carved into pristine coastlines, monuments to profit, evidence of success, or perhaps, as Lily might say, testaments to a narrow definition of value. The thought of Lily brought an unexpected warmth. They had exchanged phone numbers before parting, Alexander promising to call once he'd revised the development plans. He had called twice already, ostensibly to discuss the research center concept, but their conversations had ranged far beyond business, extending late into the night. Her perspective, so different from anyone in his usual circle, both challenged and refreshed him. When he entered the conference room, the usual ritualized deference played out. Executives straightening in their chairs, conversations ceasing mid-sentence, all eyes turning to him with calculated respect. Alexander had once savored this performance of power. Today, it felt hollow. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began without preamble, "I've made a decision regarding the Anderson Forest property." Marcus, his chief legal advisor, smiled confidently. "The environmental concerns have been addressed, I presume. We've prepared the necessary applications for the zoning variances, and our contacts at the county level are amenable to expediting the process." "Actually," Alexander said, placing his new plans on the table, "we're going to pursue a different direction entirely." For the next 30 minutes, Alexander outlined his vision for the Anderson Forest Research Center, a state-of-the-art facility that would preserve 90% of the forest while creating a hub for botanical research, focusing particularly on medicinal plants with potential pharmaceutical applications. "We'll partner with universities," he explained, advancing through digital renderings that showed low-impact buildings nestled harmoniously among the trees. "The Blackwood Foundation will establish an endowment to ensure ongoing protection and study of the ecosystem." As he spoke, Alexander watched the reactions around the table: confusion, disbelief, calculation. His executive team wasn't following his reasoning. They were assessing how this unexpected pivot would affect their bonuses, their positions, their futures in a company whose CEO had apparently lost his mind. "With all due respect, sir," Marcus said when Alexander finished, "this proposal represents a significant departure from our core business model. The projected returns are minimal compared to the resort development." "The returns aren't measured purely in dollars," Alexander replied, realizing how foreign such a statement would have sounded coming from him just a week ago. "Our investors expect consistent growth," Jennifer from finance pointed out, her tone carefully neutral, but her expression skeptical. "This is essentially a charitable project masquerading as a business venture." Alexander had anticipated this response. In fact, he had made the same argument countless times over the years, shutting down any project that prioritized social or environmental benefits over maximum profit. It's a long-term investment, he countered, not just in land or buildings, but in knowledge, in innovation, in our reputation as a company that recognizes the value of natural resources beyond their development potential. He could see he wasn't convincing them. They were humoring him, waiting for this strange phase to pass, certain that the Alexander Blackwood they knew would eventually return to his senses. "Look," he said, changing tactics, "I've spent my career making decisions that maximize short-term profit. It's made us all very wealthy. But I've seen something in that forest that can't be quantified on a balance sheet." "And what might that be?" Marcus asked, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. Alexander thought of Ember's wild grace, of Lily's passionate defense of the forest, of the complex web of life he'd glimpsed during his brief time there. How could he possibly explain to these people, whose worldview was as narrow as his had been, the profound shift in perspective he'd experienced? "Potential," he said finally. "Not just for profit, but for discovery, for learning, for preserving something irreplaceable while still creating value. Different kinds of value." Jennifer exchanged glances with Marcus. "Perhaps we should discuss this further when you've had more time to consider all the implications," she suggested delicately. They thought he was having some sort of breakdown. The realization might have angered him a week ago, but now he found it almost amusing. They couldn't see beyond the paradigm that had shaped their careers, the same paradigm he had championed for decades. "The decision is made," Alexander said firmly. "We're proceeding with the research center concept. Those who want to be part of this new direction are welcome to stay. Those who don't," he shrugged, "I'll understand if you choose to pursue opportunities elsewhere." The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of technical questions, cautious objections, and subtle power plays as his team adjusted to this new reality. Throughout it all, Alexander remained resolute. For the first time in his career, he was making a business decision based on principles beyond profit, and it felt unexpectedly liberating. When the meeting finally ended, Alexander returned to his office and closed the door, shutting out the whispers and concerned glances that followed him down the hallway. He took out his phone and dialed a number he already knew by heart. "Lily," he said when she answered, "how would you feel about being the lead researcher for the Anderson Forest Research Center?" 1 year later, Alexander stood on the observation deck of the newly completed Anderson Forest Research Center. The autumn air carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves and the subtle sweetness of late-blooming wildflowers. Below him, the main facility blended almost seamlessly with its surroundings. Living roofs covered in native plants, walls of reclaimed wood and local stone, windows positioned to maximize natural light while minimizing bird strikes. Solar panels captured energy, while innovative water systems collected and purified rainwater for the building's needs. It had been the most challenging project of his career, not because of technical difficulties or budget constraints, but because it had required him to reimagine the very purpose of development. Every decision, from site placement to material selection, had been made with preservation as the primary goal. Construction crews had worked under strict protocols to minimize disruption to the forest ecosystem. The result was a building that existed in harmony with its environment rather than dominating it. "Penny for your thoughts?" Lily appeared beside him, her hair caught in the breeze. She had traded her usual field clothes for a more professional outfit today, a concession to the donors, researchers, and officials who would be arriving soon for the center's official opening ceremony. "Just admiring our work," Alexander replied, feeling the now familiar warmth that her presence always brought. "Though I still think the eastern wing should have been rotated 15 degrees to better capture the morning light," Lily finished for him, a teasing smile on her lips. "You've mentioned that approximately 73 times now." Alexander laughed, accepting the gentle ribbing. His perfectionism hadn't disappeared during his transformation. It had merely found new focus. "I'll stop bringing it up when you admit I was right about the laboratory layout." "Never," Lily declared, though her eyes sparkled with amusement. Their professional partnership had evolved over the months of planning and construction, developing into something neither had anticipated when they first met in the forest. Something deeper, more complex, and infinitely more rewarding than either could have imagined. From below came the sound of vehicles arriving, the first guests for the opening ceremony. Alexander straightened his tie, feeling a momentary return of his old corporate instincts. Today was important not just for him and Lily, but for the future of the research center and the forest it would help protect. "Ready to charm some donors?" Lily asked, reading his shift in demeanor. "Always," Alexander replied with a confidence that was genuine. If there was one skill from his previous life that served him well in this new chapter, it was his ability to persuade people with money to support his vision. As they walked toward the stairs, Lily paused, touching his arm. "Wait, before we go down there and this place officially becomes public, I want to show you something." She led him along the deck to the far side of the building, where the forest stretched uninterrupted to the horizon. Without explanation, she raised 2 fingers to her lips and produced a distinctive whistle, the same one Alexander had heard when she first calmed Ember during their initial encounter. For a moment, nothing happened. Then movement caught Alexander's eye, a flash of chestnut among the trees moving with purpose toward the clearing near the research center. Ember emerged from the forest, his coat gleaming in the autumn sunlight, his bearing as proud and wild as ever. "He still comes when you call," Alexander observed, marveling at the connection between woman and horse. "Not always," Lily replied. "Only when he chooses to. That's the beauty of it. His freedom remains intact. Our relationship exists because of mutual respect, not ownership or control." Alexander nodded, understanding the subtle lesson in her words. Over the past year, he had learned to embrace a different kind of relationship, not just with Lily or Ember, but with the natural world itself. Not domination or exploitation, but partnership and stewardship. Ember approached the edge of the deck, close enough that Alexander could see the intelligence in his dark eyes. The horse that had once nearly trampled him now regarded him with what seemed like recognition, perhaps even acceptance. "He approves, I think," Lily said softly, "of the center, of you." Alexander reached out slowly, palm flat, offering rather than taking. After a moment's consideration, Ember stretched his neck and briefly touched his velvet muzzle to Alexander's hand, a gesture so gentle it barely registered as physical contact, yet so profound that Alexander felt it resonate through his entire being. "Thank you," he murmured, unsure if he was addressing the horse, Lily, or some larger force that had orchestrated his unexpected journey. Ember tossed his head, then turned and cantered back toward the forest, disappearing among the trees as suddenly as he had appeared. "We should join our guests," Lily said, though her eyes lingered on the spot where Ember had vanished. The opening ceremony went flawlessly. Alexander delivered a compelling speech about the center's mission, highlighting the groundbreaking research already underway and the potential for discovering new medicines from the forest's botanical treasures. Lily spoke about specific projects, her passion evident in every word. University partners outlined collaborative initiatives, while local officials praised the economic benefits of ecotourism and scientific prestige. What none of the speakers mentioned, but what Alexander knew to be true, was how close this forest had come to a completely different fate. The blueprints for luxury cabins and golf courses still existed somewhere in his company's archives, a reminder of the path not taken. As the celebration continued inside, Alexander slipped away for a moment of solitude. He walked to the edge of the clearing where the maintained grounds gave way to the wild forest. A year ago, he would have seen only untapped potential for profit in these trees. Now he saw a complex living system, valuable not for what it could become under human development, but for what it already was. He thought about the changes in his life since that fateful day when a wild horse had challenged his entry into this forest. His company, under his new direction, had begun evaluating all projects through a lens of sustainability and long-term impact. He had established an environmental division that specialized in conservation-focused development. His personal fortune remained substantial, but he now measured success differently, not by what he accumulated, but by what he preserved and protected. And then there was Lily. Their relationship had developed slowly, thoughtfully, with the same care they had given to designing the research center. She had shown him a different way of moving through the world, not rushing to transform everything he touched, but sometimes simply bearing witness to beauty that already existed. A familiar whistle sounded from behind him, and he turned to see Lily approaching, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. "Escaping your own party?" she asked, offering him one of the glasses. "Just taking a moment to appreciate what we've accomplished," he replied, "and what we saved." Lily smiled, understanding in her eyes. "To new beginnings," she said, raising her glass. "And wild horses," Alexander added, touching his glass to hers. As they stood together at the forest's edge, Alexander felt something he had rarely experienced in his driven, acquisition-focused life: contentment. Not the restless satisfaction of a deal closed or a competitor outmaneuvered, but a deep, quiet certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. Somewhere in the forest, a wild horse ran free, unaware that his momentary aggression had changed not just one man's life, but the future of an entire ecosystem. Or perhaps, Alexander thought as he gazed into the depths of the trees, Ember had known exactly what he was doing all along.